Alright, let's now look at the final reason, the final sets of short-term reasons for the outbreak of World War II in the Asia Pacific. Now, our good old friend, the League of Nations, if you would recall them, you probably, especially from the European chapters for chapter 4 and 5, and even from chapter 1, you may not have heard much good stuff about them, and for good reason. This organization was generally quite ineffective, as you would have learned about how they were not able to do a lot in Europe to stop Hitler, and in Asia, they were pretty much as ineffective in trying to stop the Japanese. In particular, the Japanese in their aggression in China, from what we learned about earlier during the Sino-Japanese War, Second Sino-Japanese War. Okay, and even before that, in the invasion of Manchuria. Now, what's the context of this? Excuse me. Okay. Oh dear, sorry. Okay, context of this was that, the Chinese, spoiler alert, excuse me. Okay, the Chinese were too preoccupied with their own civil war to resist the attack. Okay, this was one consideration which the Japanese had in deciding to attack Manchuria, because they knew that the Chinese at that time, their own civil war was going on, and so they were distracted, right? They were not able to give their full focus, full attention to defending Manchuria. Alright, so as a result of this, like we already said earlier, the Japanese established the Manchukuo satellite state. Again, if you remember our friend, another spoiler alert, sorry, Puyi here. Alright, if you want to find out more about him, incidentally, watch Bernardo Bertolucci's The Last Emperor. I believe it's from 1987. Right, end of advertisement. So Puyi was the puppet ruler, but basically the Japanese were the puppet masters, right? Chinese response, obviously, were they happy? Obviously not. They refused to recognize Manchukuo. They refused to accept that Manchukuo was now supposed to be an independent country, of course, in actual fact, under the Japanese. Alright, they claimed that it rightfully belonged to China. And you could say, that's pretty much a fair sentiment, since Manchuria was under Chinese rule at that point in time, right? And the Japanese had invaded. So China had a case, but what did the League of Nations do? They didn't do nothing. They did launch an investigation led by Lord Lytton, hence the name, the Lytton Report. But, pardon the pun, very bad pun came out of it. Very little came out of the Lytton Report. Alright, even though under this report, it was recognized, the League of Nations did recognize that Japanese actions had gone far beyond self-defense. Remember, the initial reason why Japan launched the attack, they said, was because of the supposed Chinese nationalists who had bombed, in the Mukden incident, they had bombed the Japanese own railway near Mukden, and they said whatever action they took in Manchuria was because of self-defense. But the Lytton Report decided that no, Japan was doing far more than just defending themselves. What's the outcome of this Lytton Report? Now, under this report, which condemned Japan's aggression, the result, Japan's aggression was condemned, and the League of Nations refused to recognize Manchukuo. That being said, not much more was taken. No real big punishment of Japan was announced. Nevertheless, Japan's reaction, they were not happy. They withdrew from the League of Nations. They marched out, their delegation marched out of the League of Nations when this was being announced. And as a result of this, since Japan withdrew from the League of Nations, the League of Nations had no more power over Japan, right? Because Japan was no longer a member. And so whatever punishment or whatever action that the League of Nations did decide that they could have taken, that they wanted to take against Japan, could not be done because Japan simply left. Right? Again, this should sound very similar to you because Hitler pretty much did the same thing, right? During the disarmament conference, the World Disarmament Conference at Geneva in the 1930s, he basically just walked out of it, alright? And because of that, the League of Nations had no more power over Germany. Japan's aggression, just like Germany's aggression in Europe, went on unchecked as a result. And so the League of Nations, whatever actions they tried to take, came to naught. In other words, not very effective in trying to invade Manchuria. Okay, sorry, in trying to stop the Japanese invasion of Manchuria. Now, 6 years later, the Second Sino-Japanese War, what we talked about earlier, China, again, you can imagine, not happy. They appealed to the League of Nations to intervene, to come in and do something. League of Nations, however, did not take any action. In action, as you can see there, why did they not take any action? At this point in time, you must remember, 1937, World War II in Europe had not yet started, however, okay, things were becoming more tense, particularly due to the actions of Hitler and even his friend Mussolini in Abyssinia in Italy. Okay, his Italian friend Mussolini's actions in Abyssinia and so on and so forth. Alright, basically there were so many things going on in Europe that were bothering the League of Nations enough such that they paid less attention to what was going on in Asia in the Second Sino-Japanese War, occupied with developments in Europe. Resulting from this, as due in particular to Hitler's expansionist efforts. What's the significance of this? Put yourself in Japan's shoes. You can imagine that if they see that the League of Nations is ineffective in trying to stop them in Manchuria, and now with developments in Europe going on and League of Nations not paying much attention to what Japan was doing, this made it more likely for Japan to get away scot-free with whatever further aggression it would take, right? And true enough, Japan became more confident to continue its acts of aggression, which leads us to what you'll see, over here later on. But before that, we follow up on the worsening relations with the USA. We talked a bit about this earlier in the previous video, the second video of the long-term reasons. Developing on from there, so just to do a quick recap here. Alright, remember, the Japanese were not happy about American racism against not just the Japanese, but Asians in general, right? And this led to a bad, not so good a relationship between the two. Now, however, the USA had pretty much stayed out of Japan's business because, you should recall, the US was following the policy of isolationism, where they would not get involved in other countries' affairs, in particular if it would have the potential to lead to war. Alright, and so they were pretty much minding their own business. However, in light of what happened in China with the Second Sino-Japanese War, the US policy changed. They recognized that Japan was an aggressor nation. And of course, when you say some country is an aggressor, that never is a good thing, right? It means they are the bad guy, right, so to speak. Context behind this: why did the policy change? Why did the US basically they weren't being very isolationist by saying this? Reason? The context of this, like I said, the policy of isolationism and the Neutrality Act, they said they would be neutral, yet they still said this, and they did so due to events like what I mentioned. Firstly, in China, what did they do? Not isolationist anymore if you are going to send military aid to China. In fact, President Roosevelt, whom I'll talk a bit more about later, he stated that aggressor nations, in particular Japan in this case, needed to be quarantined. In other words, you have to take actions to prevent aggressor nations from becoming more aggressive. So they sent military aid to China. Obviously this is not something very neutral, right? If you send aid to someone, means you are trying to help them against someone else, and therefore you are not neutral. Economically, how did this affect Japan? They cancelled the US-Japan Commercial Treaty, and this meant that restrictions were placed on Japanese trade in the USA. So again, this would affect the Japanese economy more so than it would have affected the US economy in a negative way. Why was the US willing to take such action? Because American public opinion sided with China. In other words, American people felt bad for China, so they supported China rather than Japan in this Second Sino-Japanese War. Now, 3 years later, the Japanese expanded into parts of Vietnam, the northern part of Vietnam, Tonkin. Okay, and so this was a further act of aggression. Now, previously, as a result of the invasion of China, there was restrictions placed on Japanese trade with the US. Now things got worse. More than just restrictions, a trade embargo was imposed on Japan, which means that essential resources such as steel and fuel were not allowed to be exported to Japan. And this was significant because a lot of Japanese resources for the war, a lot of it came from the US, and now that the US refused to export these to Japan, this would affect Japan's war effort. As a result of this, the US indirectly became one of Japan's enemies. Why indirectly? Because they had not declared war, right? They were still at peace with each other. Japan had two options as a result of this. They could stop its aggressive actions since its main supply of resources was now cut off, and by withdrawing from China, stop its aggressive actions by withdrawing from China, or it could carry on fighting, but in the meantime find alternative sources for resources. Don't get confused now. Alternative sources for the resources and raw materials which were required to support its economy and its military. So if it wanted to continue fighting, it had to find somewhere else to get its supply of resources and raw materials from. Alright? So this again means that now already obviously the US was not in such a good relationship with Japan, and Japan was hungry for more land, more resources, and so how is this going to come together? It came together in the attack of Pearl Harbor, 7th December 1941. Now, why did Japan end up doing this? Attacking Pearl Harbor. They felt they could not back down by withdrawing from China. If you recall from the first video, when we talk about the context of context of Japan, they believed that backing down and surrendering was the worst possible thing you could do, right? They felt you could not back down by withdrawing from China. And since they already were fighting in China, they did not want to stop fighting in China halfway simply because they didn't have any resources, right? And so they needed to find more resources rather than stop fighting. At the same time, military leaders, remember, who were now leading the way in Japan, they had convinced the emperor that a war with the USA was unavoidable. Eventually it would happen, right? So even if Japan were not to get into conflict with the US at that point in time, they said that eventually they would still fight with the US. So there's no way you could avoid it, right? The Japanese also had hoped for a quick knockout blow, through the use of surprise. Of course, the Pearl Harbor attack, if you recall from the snippets of the videos which we've shown you in class, and which also is in one of the other YouTube videos here, you know that this was a surprise attack, right? It's used in order to stun the American forces. So the hope was that you deliver a knockout blow and the US would be out of commission, so that the US would not be able to stop the Japanese from further expanding into Southeast Asia, right, as part of the Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere plan. Another reason why the Japanese decided to launch this attack on Pearl Harbor was because of the ongoing war in Europe. Alright? Now, by this time, 1941, war already was going on in Europe, in fact, for more than 2 whole years, right? And as a result of this war, Britain and France were preoccupied with the ongoing war in Europe. This meant that their forces, they had some forces in the Asia Pacific, but these forces were weak because the bulk of their military forces were focused on trying to defeat Germany in Europe, right, rather than defending its whatever small colonies in the Asia Pacific. Sorry, forgot to go through that earlier, but just to show you, war was unavoidable. War with USA was unavoidable as resources were running out. And over here, use the element of surprise. This would mean Japan would gain swift sea and air control in the Pacific and be in the driver's seat for the rest of the war and emerge victorious. Okay, sorry, I didn't manage to go through that earlier, but I trust you can follow through with that. Now, so it's the British and French forces in the Asia Pacific were weak, and this meant that colonies in Southeast Asia were seen as vulnerable, right? Because they were not defended well by the British and the French, or the Dutch for that matter. Who were they defended by? Yes, they were still defended by the Western forces, but a much more limited supply, okay? And so they were seen as vulnerable to Japan through war in Asia Pacific. So this again encouraged Japan to launch the attack on Pearl Harbor, because by launching the attack on Pearl Harbor, this would put the Americans out of commission. And if you put the Americans out of commission, this would mean that all the Western forces in Southeast Asia would be weak enough for the Japanese to swiftly overtake Southeast Asia. Okay, I hope you understand that. So again, the actions. Okay, remember this was a surprise attack. So while they were planning, and even while their planes were on the way to Hawaii for the attack, they carried on diplomatic negotiations with the Americans, giving the Americans the impression that the Japanese did not want to fight. They were willing to find a peaceful solution to the matter. Yet, they launched the surprise attack on Pearl Harbor. Okay. As a result of this, over 2,400 or 2,400 Americans were killed. Significant damage was done to the US Pacific Fleet. I'm going to show you a picture of here. Now, this is the aftermath on one of the main American ships called the USS Arizona. Okay, it was sunk, and I believe many hundreds, in fact, may even be up to 1,000, more than 1,000, just on this ship alone, passed away. Okay, as a result of a surprise Japanese attack. And today, if you were to go there, you'll see a memorial in remembrance of those who died in the USS Arizona and the Pearl Harbor attack in general. Okay, significant damage was done to the US Pacific Fleet, meaning the US military forces stationed in the Pacific Ocean, which is where the fighting was taking place against Japan. Alright. At the same time, the Japanese launched their attack on Southeast Asia. Okay, at the same time, because if they had launched the attack on Southeast Asia before the Pearl Harbor attack would not have been much of a surprise, right? Because the Americans would know that the Japanese would be coming after them. And if the Americans had launched the attack on Pearl Harbor before they launched the attack on Southeast Asia, then the Western forces and the Southeast Asians would know that the Japanese were on the way, right? So this was done at the same time. Okay, in fact, the Japanese landings on Kota Baru in the northeast Peninsula Malaysia coast, which event happened at the same time, okay, on 8th December. Okay, it's actually the same day because of the international deadline. But anyway, the Japanese landed in Kota Baru in Kelantan at the same time and eventually made their way down the Malay Peninsula. And then that was 8 December 1941. Just over 2 months later, 15th February 1942, Singapore had fallen to the Japanese. Alright, so remember we talked a bit about that when I showed you those pictures during the first video. Okay, but anyway, yes, this is what the Japanese had done. American response, they declared war on Japan. Okay, this started World War II in the Asia Pacific. Okay, now let me see if I can play you excerpts of this. Give me a moment. Okay. It's quite working. Okay, never mind. I can play you this in class. But anyway, let me try that again. Okay, it's not going to work. But never mind. Let me just show you here. Oops, I don't have it here. Okay, never mind. We'll talk about that in class. Apologies for that. But basically, you can see here how eventually through these actions earlier on, these factors in the short term linked to what we saw earlier on in the long term. All of this eventually led to the Japanese deciding to attack Pearl Harbor, and this attack on Pearl Harbor officially started World War II in the Asia Pacific, with the Americans declaring war on Japan. Alright, now that's it for this chapter. Again, remember this is very important for your SEQ. Okay, so please do have a look at this again. Go through. If you have any questions, do look for Mr. Ong or myself, because this is an important chapter for your essays. Alright, thank you and goodbye and Happy New Year.